The crack of the rifle echoed across the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, silencing the crowd that had gathered outside the small whitewashed church on that sweltering summer day in 1874. Pearline Zimmerman's tear-streaked face turned toward the sound, her body still restrained by the iron grip of her father and uncle as they dragged her toward the church steps, where Bartholomew Wilkes, the wealthiest cattle baron in the territory, stood waiting with a gleaming gold ring and a predatory smile. "That girl is already promised to me," came a steady voice from the end of the street. Jake Forrester sat atop his dappled gray stallion, rifle pointed skyward, his face partially obscured by the wide brim of his worn leather hat. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the packed dirt street as townsfolk scattered to porches and alleyways, sensing the dangerous electricity in the air. Henry Zimmerman, Pearline's father, tightened his grip on his daughter's arm. "This ain't your concern, Forrester. My daughter's marrying Wilkes today, and that's final." Pearline's chest heaved with silent sobs, her once pristine white dress now stained with dust from being forcibly dragged through town. Her honey blonde hair had come loose from its pins, falling in waves around her shoulders. For weeks she had fought against this arrangement, but her father's gambling debts to Wilkes had sealed her fate, or so everyone thought. Jake dismounted with fluid grace, the spurs on his boots jingling softly as he approached. At 26, he had the weathered look of a man who'd spent his life under the harsh western sun. His blue eyes never left Pearline's face as he moved closer. "Let her go," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "We made a promise to each other 3 months ago, before I rode out to the Montana territory." Bartholomew Wilkes stepped forward, his expensive suit and polished boots marking him as a man unaccustomed to being denied. At 45, his salt and pepper hair and considerable girth spoke of his wealth and power in the territory. "That's a bold claim, Forrester," Wilkes said, his hand hovering near the pearl-handled pistol at his hip. "Especially from a man who owns nothing but a broken-down ranch and that mangy horse." The crowd that had gathered for the wedding murmured and shifted. Many knew Jake Forrester, had watched him grow from a scrappy orphan taken in by old Samuel Peters to a hardworking rancher trying to make something of the small spread he'd inherited when Peters passed. They also knew Wilkes and his reputation for taking what he wanted, whether it was land, cattle, or women. "I may not have much," Jake replied, taking another step forward, "but I've got something you'll never have, Wilkes. Honor," Pearline's father scoffed. "Honor doesn't pay debts, boy." "I owe Wilkes more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes. This marriage settles it." "So you're selling your daughter," Jake's voice carried across the hushed street. "Is that what a father does in Redemption Creek these days?" The accusation hung in the air, causing several townsfolk to look away in shame. They'd all known what was happening but had been too afraid of Wilkes to intervene. Pearline finally found her voice, though it quavered with emotion. "I never agreed to this. Never." She turned to her father with pleading eyes. "Please, Pa, don't do this." Silence. Henry Zimmerman's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You'll do as you're told," Sheriff Miller pushed through the crowd, his badge catching the sunlight. "What's the meaning of this disturbance?" "We've got a wedding about to commence." "No wedding today, Sheriff," Jake said firmly. "Pearline and I exchanged promises before I left for Montana. I've come back to make good on mine." The sheriff looked between the two men, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "That true, Miss Zimmerman?" Before Pearline could answer, Wilkes stepped forward. "It doesn't matter what promises were made. I have a contract with Henry Zimmerman signed and witnessed. The girl is mine." Jake's eyes narrowed. "She's not property, Wilkes. She's a woman with her own heart and mind." "A woman needs guidance," Wilkes countered, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. "And a father has every right to determine who his daughter marries." Pearline wrenched her arm from her father's grasp. "I love Jake Forrester. I promised myself to him before he left, and I've waited faithfully for his return." Tears streamed down her face as she looked toward Jake, hope and desperation mingling in her eyes. The townsfolk murmured again, many of the women exchanging knowing glances. They had seen the young couple together in the spring, had witnessed their obvious affection for one another. "Is this true, Miss Zimmerman?" the sheriff asked again, more firmly this time. "Yes," she said, straightening her shoulders despite her tears. "Jake asked me to wait for him, to marry him when he returned with enough money to start our life together. I gave him my word." Jake reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "I've been working cattle drives up north, saved every penny." He tossed the pouch to the sheriff, who caught it with surprise. "There's enough there to cover Henry Zimmerman's debt to Wilkes, with interest." The sheriff opened the pouch, his eyebrows rising at the sight of the gold coins inside. "Looks to be about right." Henry Zimmerman's face contorted with surprise and greed. "Let me see that." He snatched the pouch from the sheriff's hands, quickly counting the contents. His expression changed as he realized the sum would indeed cover his debt. Wilkes's face darkened with rage. "This is absurd." "We had an agreement, Zimmerman." "Well," Henry said slowly, a calculating look crossing his face, "seems the situation has changed." "The situation," Wilkes spat, "is that you promised me your daughter's hand in marriage, not a bag of gold." Jake stepped closer to Pearline, who moved toward him instinctively. "The debt is what matters, isn't it? Not who Pearline marries." Mrs. Zimmerman, who had been standing silently by the church steps, suddenly stepped forward. "Henry, please, our daughter's happiness must count for something." Henry looked at his wife with surprise. Patricia Zimmerman rarely contradicted him in public, but the steel in her eyes told him she wouldn't back down on this matter. "The boy's offering to clear your debt," she continued. "Let Pearline go with him." The tension in the air was palpable as Henry Zimmerman weighed his options, the bag of gold heavy in his hand. Finally, he nodded grudgingly. "Fine, the debt is settled." He turned to Wilkes. "You'll have your money by sundown." Wilkes's face twisted with fury. "This isn't over, Forrester." "Not by a long shot." He turned on his heel and stormed away, his hired men following close behind. Pearline rushed to Jake, who wrapped his arms around her protectively. "You came back," she whispered against his chest. "I promised I would," he replied, gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "I'd never break a promise to you, Pearline." The crowd began to disperse, some looking relieved, others disappointed at the lack of a more dramatic confrontation. The sheriff nodded to Jake before walking away, leaving the young couple standing in the street with Pearline's parents. "You'd better be good to her," Henry grumbled, still clutching the pouch of gold. "Better than you've been," Jake replied evenly, earning a sharp look from the older man. Patricia Zimmerman stepped forward and embraced her daughter. "Be happy, my girl," she whispered. "Be happier than I've been." As the sun began to set over Redemption Creek, Jake helped Pearline onto his horse. "Where are we going?" she asked, still hardly believing the turn of events. "Home," he said simply, mounting behind her, "to our future." Little did they know that their ordeal was far from over. Bartholomew Wilkes was not a man who accepted defeat, and Redemption Creek was about to become the stage for a struggle that would test Jake and Pearline's love in ways they couldn't imagine. 2 days after the confrontation at the church, Jake and Pearline sat on the porch of his modest ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The Peters Place, as most locals still called it, comprised 80 acres of decent grazing land with a small creek running through the eastern section. The house itself was simple but sturdy, 2 rooms with a stone fireplace and a newly added lean-to kitchen that Jake had built the previous year. "It's not much," Jake said, a hint of apology in his voice as he looked at the weathered wood siding and patched roof. "But with the money I've saved, we can make improvements, maybe add another room before winter." Pearline squeezed his hand. "It's perfect, Jake, it's ours." The wonder in her voice was genuine. After years living under her father's oppressive roof, even this humble homestead felt like a palace of freedom. They had spent the past 2 days settling in, with Pearline arranging her few belongings and Jake showing her around the property. They'd agreed to wait a month before marrying, giving time for the scandal to die down and for Reverend Thomas to return from his circuit preaching. "I'll ride into town tomorrow," Jake said, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "We need supplies, and I want to check if there's any work available at the Donovan Ranch. They usually need extra hands this time of year." Pearline nodded, but a shadow crossed her face. "Do you think Wilkes will cause trouble?" Jake's jaw tightened. "Probably." Men like him don't take kindly to being crossed, but don't worry, I won't let anything happen to you. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Jake saddled his horse while Pearline prepared a list of items they needed from the general store. "Be careful," she said as he mounted up, unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. Jake leaned down from the saddle and kissed her softly. "I always am. Lock the door while I'm gone and remember where I keep the shotgun." Pearline watched him ride away, the dust from his horse's hooves hanging in the still morning air. Once he disappeared over the rise, she turned back to the house, determined to make it more of a home by the time he returned. In town, Jake tied his horse outside Harmon's general store and stepped inside, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. Martha Harmon looked up from behind the counter, her usual friendly smile seeming strained. "Morning, Mrs. Harmon," Jake greeted, placing Pearline's list on the counter. "Need to pick up a few things." Martha glanced nervously toward the back of the store before leaning forward. "Jake, you should know Wilkes has been asking questions about you and your property. Been talking to Judge Spencer, too." Jake's expression hardened. "What kind of questions?" "About deeds and ownership," Martha replied in a hushed tone. "And he's hired 3 new men rough types from down Texas way." Before Jake could respond, the door opened again. 2 men entered, their spurs jingling against the wooden floor. Jake recognized them immediately as Wilkes's new hired guns. "Well, look who it is," the taller one drawled, his hand resting casually on his holster. "The man who stole the boss's bride." Jake turned slowly to face them. "I didn't steal anyone. Pearline was never Wilkes's to begin with." The second man, shorter but with a nasty scar running from his left eye to his jaw, grinned unpleasantly. "Boss says different, says you embarrassed him in front of the whole town." "That's between me and Wilkes," Jake replied evenly. "Not his hired help." The first man took a step forward. "Boss wants to see you, now." "I'm busy," Jake said, turning back to the counter. "Mrs. Harmon, I'll take those supplies now." A strong hand gripped his shoulder. "Wasn't asking, Forrester." Jake moved with surprising speed, twisting away from the man's grip and stepping back to create distance between them. "Touch me again, and we're going to have a problem." The tension in the store was thick enough to cut with a knife. Martha Harmon had retreated to the far end of the counter, her face pale. 3 o'clock at the Painted Lady Saloon," the scarred man said after a tense moment. "Boss says if you don't show, he'll take it as a personal insult." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. After the men left, Jake quickly finished his business and headed to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller was at his desk, reviewing wanted posters. "Figured you'd be stopping by," Miller said without looking up. "Heard Wilkes's boys found you." Jake leaned against the doorframe. "You know what he's planning," Miller sighed, finally meeting Jake's gaze. "Nothing I can arrest him for yet. He's been talking to Judge Spencer about challenging your claim to the Peters place, saying the old man wasn't of sound mind when he left it to you." Jake's fists clenched. "That's nonsense. Sam Peters was sharp as a tack until the day he died. Judge Spencer knows that." "Judge Spencer knows which side his bread is buttered on," Miller replied grimly. "And Wilkes spreads a lot of butter around these parts." Jake paced the small office. "So what am I supposed to do?" "Just let him take everything." Miller rubbed his graying mustache thoughtfully. "My advice, meet with him, hear what he has to say, but don't go alone." He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a deputy's badge. "I've been meaning to ask you anyway, town could use another lawman, what with all the trouble lately." Jake stared at the badge. "You're deputizing me?" "Temporarily," Miller clarified. "Gives you some legal standing at least, and maybe makes Wilkes think twice before trying anything too brazen." At 3 o'clock, Jake pushed through the batwing doors of the Painted Lady Saloon, the deputy's badge pinned to his vest. The usual afternoon crowd of cowboys and drifters fell silent as he entered, all eyes turning to the back corner where Bartholomew Wilkes sat at his regular table, a glass of whiskey in front of him. Jake made his way across the room, acutely aware of the 3 hired guns positioned strategically around their boss. He stopped a few feet from Wilkes's table, keeping his hands visible but ready. "You wanted to see me," Jake said, not bothering with pleasantries. Wilkes gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down, Forrester. Let's be civilized about this." Jake remained standing. I prefer to keep this short. What do you want? Wilkes's smile didn't reach his eyes. Direct as always, very well. He took a sip of his whiskey before continuing. I want to make you an offer for your property. $500 more than fair for that run-down place. Not interested, Jake replied immediately. The ranch isn't for sale. Wilkes leaned forward. Perhaps I haven't made myself clear. This isn't merely a business proposition. It's a solution to our disagreement. There is no disagreement, Jake said firmly. Pearline chose me. Her father accepted payment for his debt. It's settled. Wilkes's smile faded. Nothing is settled until I say it is. That land connects my north and south pastures. I've wanted it for years, but that stubborn old fool Peters refused to sell. His eyes narrowed. And now you're being equally foolish. Is that why you're challenging my ownership, with some fabricated story about Sam not being of sound mind? Legal proceedings can be so unpredictable, Wilkes said with mock concern. And so expensive. Do you really have the resources for a lengthy court battle, deputy? He emphasized the title with clear disdain. Jake felt his anger rising but kept his voice steady. What I have is the truth, and people who knew Sam well enough to testify to his mental state, including Judge Spencer's own wife, who Sam treated for pneumonia 3 winters ago. A flicker of surprise crossed Wilkes's face before he masked it with another cold smile. Truth is subjective in a courtroom, and witnesses can be persuaded to remember things differently. Is that a threat, an observation? Wilkes replied smoothly. But here's something more concrete. I own the bank that holds the mortgage on the Zimmerman farm. One word from me and they're out on the street by the end of the month. He paused to let his words sink in. How do you think Pearline would feel, knowing her parents lost everything because of her choice? Jake felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He hadn't considered that Wilkes would target Pearline's family. For all their faults, he knew she still cared for them, especially her mother. That's low, even for you, Jake said quietly. Wilkes shrugged. Business is business. $1,000 for your property and the Zimmermans keep their farm. Seems like a fair trade to me. Jake's mind raced, trying to find a way out of the trap Wilkes had set. I need time to think about it. You have until tomorrow noon, Wilkes said, signaling the end of their conversation. Oh, and Forrester. Don't bother running to Sheriff Miller with this. A private business negotiation is hardly his concern. As Jake walked out of the saloon, the weight of Wilkes's ultimatum pressed down on him like a physical burden. He had no doubt the cattle baron would follow through on his threats, men like Wilkes always did. But giving up the ranch meant giving up the future he and Pearline had dreamed of. With a heavy heart, he mounted his horse and headed back to the ranch, dreading the conversation that lay ahead. When Jake arrived home, the smell of fresh baked bread greeted him. Pearline had spent the day cleaning, cooking, and making the small house feel more like a home. The smile on her face when he walked through the door made the decision he faced even more painful. You're back, she said, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. Her expression faltered when she saw his face. What's wrong? What happened in town? Jake removed his hat and set it on the table along with the deputy's badge Miller had given him. We need to talk, Pearline. Over a supper that neither of them had much appetite for, Jake explained his meeting with Wilkes and the ultimatum he'd been given. Pearline listened in growing horror, her food untouched on her plate. He can't do this, she whispered when Jake finished. It's not right. Men like Wilkes make their own rules, Jake replied wearily, and they have the money and power to enforce them. Pearline shook her head, a new determination replacing her initial shock. I won't let him destroy everything we have, not after we've come this far. What choice do we have? Jake asked. If I refuse, your parents lose their farm, your mother would have nowhere to go. We'll find another way, Pearline insisted. There has to be something we can do. They stayed up late into the night, discussing possibilities and discarding them one by one. By the time they finally went to bed, exhausted and no closer to a solution, the first hints of dawn were already lightening the eastern sky. Jake woke with the sun, having slept fitfully for only a few hours. He found Pearline already up, sitting at the table with a determined expression. I'm going to talk to my mother, she announced. If Wilkes is threatening the farm, she deserves to know. Maybe together we can think of something. Jake nodded slowly. I'll take you, but we need to be careful. Wilkes probably has men watching the Zimmerman place. They rode double on Jake's horse, taking a roundabout path to avoid being seen approaching the Zimmerman farm directly. They tethered the horse in a small grove of trees behind the barn and approached the house from the rear. Patricia Zimmerman was hanging laundry in the backyard when they arrived. She gasped at the sight of them and quickly ushered them inside, checking to make sure no one had seen. "Your father's in town," she explained as they settled in the kitchen. "What are you doing here? It's not safe." Pearline quickly explained the situation while Jake kept watch at the window. Patricia's face grew increasingly troubled as she listened. "That vile man," she murmured when Pearline finished. "I knew he was ruthless, but this." She shook her head. "What will you do?" "We don't know," Pearline admitted. "That's why we came to you. Do you have any ideas?" Patricia was silent for a long moment, her fingers worrying at her apron. "There might be something," she said finally. "Something your father doesn't know about." She rose and went to the fireplace, where she carefully removed a loose brick from the side. From the hollow space behind it, she extracted a small metal box. "My grandmother gave me this before she died," Patricia explained, opening the box to reveal a folded document and a small leather pouch. "It's the deed to a piece of land north of here, near Elkhorn Ridge. 20 acres with a natural spring. It was her dowry, separate from anything your father owns." Pearline stared at her mother in astonishment. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" "It was my secret," Patricia said simply. "My escape if things ever became unbearable." She looked directly at Jake. "Take it. Use it to bargain with Wilkes. It borders his northern pasture. He's tried to buy that land for years, but the owner always refused. He never knew it was me." Jake shook his head. "We can't take this from you, Mrs. Zimmerman. It's your safety net." Patricia pressed the deed into his hands. "My daughter's happiness is my safety net now. Please take it. Use it to secure your future together." Before they could argue further, the sound of approaching horses came from the front of the house. Patricia quickly moved to the window. "It's your father," she whispered urgently, "and he's not alone. Wilkes is with him." Jake pocketed the deed and looked for an escape route. "Is there a way out the back?" Patricia nodded. "Through the root cellar. There's a door that leads out under the apple trees. Hurry." They descended into the cool darkness of the root cellar, with Patricia following to show them the way. As they reached the outer door, she embraced her daughter fiercely. "Be happy," she whispered, "and be strong. I'll find a way to see you soon." Jake and Pearline emerged among the gnarled apple trees behind the house and made their way back to where they'd left the horse. As they mounted up, the sound of angry voices carried from the farmhouse. "We need to move fast," Jake said grimly. "Once Wilkes realizes we've been here, he'll come looking." Instead of returning to the ranch, they rode toward town. Their best chance now was to find Sheriff Miller and see if the deed Patricia had given them could be used as leverage against Wilkes. The main street was bustling with the usual late morning activity when they arrived. Jake helped Pearline down from the horse, and they quickly made their way toward the sheriff's office. They never made it. Wilkes's men stepped out from the alley beside the telegraph office, blocking their path. Behind them, the sound of more horses announced the arrival of Wilkes himself, accompanied by Henry Zimmerman and 2 more hired guns. Well, Wilkes called, dismounting smoothly despite his bulk. "Just the couple I was looking for." Jake positioned himself slightly in front of Pearline, his hand hovering near his holster. "We were just on our way to see Sheriff Miller. The sheriff's out at the Henderson place," Wilkes replied with a smirk. "Something about rustlers, convenient timing, wouldn't you say?" People on the street began to take notice of the confrontation, some hurrying away while others stopped to watch from a safe distance. "What do you want, Wilkes?" Jake demanded, acutely aware they were outnumbered. "I believe we had an appointment at noon," Wilkes said, checking his pocket watch. "You're early, but that's fine. Have you made your decision?" Henry Zimmerman stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Pearline, get away from him. You've caused enough trouble already." Pearline stood her ground. "I'm staying with Jake, Pa. This is where I belong." "Touching," Wilkes said mockingly, "but ultimately futile. Forrester, I'm assuming by your presence in town that you've decided to accept my offer." Jake felt the weight of the deed in his pocket. It could be their way out, or it could make things worse if Wilkes realized Patricia had kept it secret all these years. Actually, Jake said carefully, I have a counter-offer. Wilkes raised an eyebrow. I'm listening, though I should warn you my patience is wearing thin. Before Jake could respond, a shot rang out from the direction of the bank. All heads turned to see a man staggering out the door, a bag of money in one hand and a smoking pistol in the other. Bank robbery, someone shouted, and chaos erupted in the street. In the confusion, Jake grabbed Pearline's hand. Run, he hissed, pulling her toward the livery stable where his horse was tethered. They had almost reached it when one of Wilkes's men cut them off. Without hesitation, Jake threw a punch that connected solidly with the man's jaw, sending him sprawling in the dust. They mounted quickly and galloped out of town, not slowing until they were well away from Redemption Creek. Only then did Jake pull the horse to a walk, both of them breathing hard from the narrow escape. What now? Pearline asked, her arms still tight around Jake's waist. We use your mother's land, Jake decided, but not the way she intended. We're not trading it to Wilkes. Then how? Jake turned in the saddle to look at her. We're going to build our future on it. Tonight, we'll gather what we need from the ranch and head north. We can start fresh where Wilkes has no power. Pearline's eyes widened. Leave everything behind, just like that. Not everything, Jake said softly. We'll have each other. And sometimes, Pearline, running isn't cowardice, it's just good sense. That night, under cover of darkness, they returned briefly to Jake's ranch to collect essentials. Tools, seeds, clothing, and the small box of keepsakes that had belonged to Sam Peters. By dawn, they were headed north toward Elkhorn Ridge and the land that would become their new home. Word reached them a week later, brought by a friendly trapper who'd passed through Redemption Creek. The bank robber had been caught and turned out to be a drifter with no connection to Wilkes. More interestingly, Judge Spencer had suffered a crisis of conscience after Sheriff Miller confronted him about colluding with Wilkes. The judge had publicly recused himself from any cases involving the cattle baron and had written a letter to the territorial governor detailing Wilkes's attempts to corrupt local officials. The most surprising news, however, was about Patricia Zimmerman. She had finally stood up to her husband, threatening to expose his dealings with Wilkes to the entire territory if he didn't end his association with the man. Henry, already facing scrutiny because of Judge Spencer's revelations, had grudgingly agreed. Your mother's a brave woman, Jake said as they sat by the campfire that night, the framework of their new cabin taking shape behind them. Pearline smiled, her hand resting on her stomach in a gesture that had become familiar over the past few days. She is. And I hope our child inherits that courage. Jake's head snapped up. Our child? Pearline's smile widened. I wasn't sure until yesterday, but yes, Jake Forrester, you're going to be a father. Jake moved around the fire and took her in his arms, his heart so full he could barely speak. I love you, Pearline, more than I ever thought possible. She leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. And I love you. Thank you for standing up for me that day at the church, for saying I was already promised to you. It was the truth, Jake said simply. From the moment I first saw you, my heart was yours. Above them, the vast western sky stretched endlessly, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet darkness. Their future, once threatened by Wilkes's greed and power, now lay before them full of promise and hope. The land Patricia had gifted them would become their legacy, a home built on love rather than obligation, a place where their children would grow up knowing the value of courage and the power of true devotion. As spring turned to summer, their cabin rose steadily, log by log. Pearline's belly grew round with their child, and news occasionally reached them from Redemption Creek. Wilkes's influence had waned considerably after Judge Spencer's revelations, and many of those he had intimidated now found the courage to stand against him. Patricia Zimmerman visited them that August, making the journey north with a trader's wagon. The reunion between mother and daughter was tearful and joyous, with Patricia marveling at the progress they had made on their homestead. You've built something beautiful here, she told them, looking around at the cabin with its stone chimney and the small garden Pearline had planted. We couldn't have done it without you, Jake said sincerely. Your gift gave us our freedom. Patricia smiled, though there was sadness in her eyes. "I only wish I'd found my own courage sooner." "It's never too late," Pearline told her, taking her mother's hand and placing it on her rounded belly. "You're welcome here anytime. This little one will need their grandmother." In late October, as the aspen leaves turned gold and the first snow dusted the highest peaks, Pearline gave birth to a daughter they named Hope. She had Jake's blue eyes and Pearline's determined chin, and from her first breath, she filled their cabin with joy. On the day of Hope's christening, performed by a traveling preacher in their small front room, they received unexpected visitors. Sheriff Miller arrived with news that Bartholomew Wilkes had left the territory, his empire crumbling after the territorial governor launched an investigation into his business practices. "Seems your stand against him started something," Miller told Jake as they stood on the porch, watching the snow fall gently around them. "Gave others the courage to speak up about his intimidation and corrupt dealings. We just wanted to be left alone," Jake said, "to build our life together." Miller nodded. Sometimes the bravest acts are the simplest ones. He gestured toward the cabin where Pearline sat by the fire, their daughter in her arms. "You've got something special here, Forrester, something Wilkes with all his money and power never understood." As the sheriff rode away, Jake returned to the warmth of their home. He knelt beside Pearline's chair and gently touched their daughter's cheek. "Sheriff says we're safe now," he told her softly. "Wilkes is gone." Pearline smiled, the firelight playing across her face. "We were always safe, Jake. From the moment you stood up in that church and claimed me as yours." Jake leaned forward and kissed her, a promise renewed with each passing day. "Always," he whispered against her lips, "always and forever." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their small corner of the frontier in pristine white. Inside, warmed by love and protected by courage, a family that had been forged in adversity looked toward a future bright with possibility, a future they had claimed for themselves against all odds. And in the years that followed, whenever travelers passed through the valley and saw the thriving homestead with its expanding fields and growing family, they would hear the story of the cowboy who had stood against a powerful man for love, and the woman who had found the strength to choose her own destiny. Their tale became a legend in those parts, a reminder that even in the wildest stretches of the frontier, true love could take root and flourish, changing not just two lives but an entire community. Jake and Pearline Forrester lived that legend every day, their love a beacon that guided them through all the challenges and joys that life on the frontier could bring, a love that had begun with a desperate stand outside a church and had grown into something as enduring as the mountains that watched over their home.